let's talk about CSS Grid. On the last week, we show how to build powerful layouts using Flex. And that was probably all we need to start building decent layouts in CSS. However, there is now an alternative to Flex box, which is called Grid. So today I would like to first of all show how Grid works, and then I'll try to explain briefly the similarities and differences between Flexbox and Grid. So let's first of all focus on, let's ignore Flex. Yeah, let's just try to learn how Grid works, and then we'll compare it with Flex. So if I want to use Grid, the first thing I will do is I'm going to create some sort of div. And guys, there is some background. Let me try to see who can mute. Sorry, guys. So yeah, whoever, guys, please, if you're making some noise, please make sure you mute yourself. Thank you very much. All right, so I got a div. You see, that's my div. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create some sort of class to identify that I'm gonna use Grid here. So what's the name of that class? Once again, that's up to you. I can call it Brexit. Yeah, that's fine. However, do you remember, guys, any of the naming conventions we used on the last week to define the surrounding, the parent element with Flex? Container or wrapper, yeah, fantastic. So let's just reduce the semantics. Yeah, why not? Why not? Cool. So now I'm gonna create, I'm essentially replicating the example I built on the last week. So if you then rewatch both workshops, you'll find out to spot some similarities. Yeah. So just few boxes. So what should be the class name of the child elements, guys? Item, fantastic. So let me create 3 items: item 1, item 2, and item 3, for instance. Yep. All right. So, of course, let's talk a bit about CSS, right? I'm gonna add some styles to my CSS app.css. I'll snap my CSS on the right-hand side, so hopefully we can check HTML and CSS side by side. So now I will do dot item. Remember, to be precise, we should name space the item by doing app and then space dot item. So then if someone else creates an item somewhere else, then our styles won't affect his or her piece of code. So once we got that, just something silly like border 1 pixel solid red, maybe padding 10 pixels, whatever. Yep, something like that. And now back to the web browser. Let's see what we get. If I refresh, you see I got all the 3 elements one after the other, because as you remember, HTML by definition is a block-based language. So when you display a div, it will occupy all the available space in that row. Yeah. So last week we saw how to change that using display flex. So similarly, we can use another CSS rule called display grid, unsurprisingly. Yeah? So will this line have any impact on the user interface? Well, I'll tell you something, not yet. If you remember, as soon as we type display flex, we got some changes immediately. If I refresh, wait a minute, is it, wait a minute, display item, is it actually display flex? That's a bit strange. The what, sorry, what did I do wrong? Sorry, guys. I'm still, thinking on the weekend. Of course, sorry. Ignore me, guys. Ignore me. Absolutely, Lawrence. So it should be within the container, yeah, not on the item. That's my full Monday morning classic. All right, so display flex on the parent. Yeah, when you do that, then it has some sort of change, some sort of impact. When I put display grid, yep, nothing actually changes. That means that I need to do something else. That's not enough. So with Flex, if you remember, we played with both the parent and the child. We need to play in both sides to build a nice layout where if we got 3 items, so each item span 1/3 of the available space using the fragments, if you remember. When using Grid, I think it's slightly easier to some extent because Grid can only focus on the container, on the parent. I don't need to take any action on the child, which simplifies things a bit. Yeah? So now the point is, how can I build a layout with 3 columns? You need to add a new property called grid template columns. And now, even though multiple options are available, I need to tell you something, guys. Grid is a huge wall. I'm not an expert on Grid, to be honest with you. So you could spend hours and hours and hours and even days learning how Grid works. Yeah? But at least today, we're going to talk about the basics. So Grid template columns, now I can specify a list of fragments. So I can do something like that. 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. You see? So can anyone tell me? Actually, sorry, no, I'm not gonna say can anyone tell me because on Friday on the Reddit told me don't say that anymore. So I'm gonna ask someone individually. So can, for instance, Max, can you tell me how many virtual columns, how many fragments our layout will have? 3. All right. And how the layout will look like? Equal size. So will the 3 items span all the available width on my screen? All right. You're right. You see? You see? So can anyone tell me how to build literally the same layout using Flex? Maxim? Mm-hmm. No, I think you are mixing things, guys. So you're mixing things here, Maxim. So with Flex Direction, we got row, but last week we said that that's the default. So let's simplify things a bit, right? We don't need it. Does anyone remember what do we need on the item level? Flex 1, that's correct, Lauren. Flex 1 to make sure that we are building 3 different fragments. So when we do Flex 1 on the item, you see, we get literally the same result. In this particular case, if that's what we want to build, it doesn't really matter if we use Flex or Grid because I think the effort is pretty much the same. You see, you can either write the commented lines, 6 and 7, or you can write line number 8 and line number 14. Okay? Personally, even if that's all we need to build, I would rather prefer to use Grid because it feels, I don't know, a bit easier because of 2 reasons. First of all, because we explicitly build the number of columns. You see, 1, 1, 1. You can immediately see we got 3 columns. With Flex approach, this conclusion is indirect because what you see, you don't see how many columns you have. You see that each column spans 1 fragment. Then, because you see on the left-hand side, you got 3 columns, you see, you do the maths mentally, and then you see that the result is the same. But it's not that obvious. The second reason is with Grid, we're putting all the relevant, all the layouting stuff together, you see, in 2 lines, one after the other. With Flex, that's a bit more difficult to spot because you got part of the grid stuff, part of the layouting stuff here in the container, part of the layout stuff for later on the child. I don't know, maybe it's just a personal feeling, but in this particular case, I would rather prefer to use Grid. Do you have any questions so far? No. Yep. I don't. Not as far as I'm aware. I don't think there are any concerns regarding performance in that respect. Yeah. However, Grid is more recent than Flex, so that means that you need to be careful, especially if you are supporting all browsers. So guys, there is a website called caniuse.com where if you search, look, that's interesting, right? Most search features, actually Flexbox and Grid, they are the top two most searched features, right? So people want to know whether they can use Flex and Grid depending on the browser they are supporting. So for instance, if I select Flexbox, you can see that actually the majority of the web browsers are today using Flexbox. You see, Alaya, I told you not to use Internet Explorer anymore unless it's strictly necessary, because Internet Explorer is clearly a legacy browser. Yeah, no one cares about it anymore. Actually, look, 1.4% of the total global population is using IE these days, right? So don't use it. Don't use it. We've been struggling with it for decades. So I think it's time to ignore it. So this is about Flexbox, but what about Grid? Not Gerd. Grid. CSS Grid. All right, that's not bad. That's not bad. It's quite well supported. Okay, there are some particularities. So, for instance, if because of whatever reason you want to support, I know actually that's all right. That's a bit weird. Not supported. What that means? Support info, not support is why it says all. All right. So apparently, if I read that correctly, Opera Mini doesn't support Grid at all. Yeah. Only 0.6% of the browsers are Opera Mini, so that's probably not a big problem. You got some, but you got some other browsers here on the right hand side, minor browsers. But I mean, probably today that's not a problem anymore. But 2-3 years ago, definitely you got quite more red color here than green. Yeah? So just be careful. Just be careful. When you use a new sexy cool feature, you need to make sure that that feature is supported in all the browsers you want to support. All right, so that's, sorry guys, where I am. That's what we got so far about Flex versus Grid. But now let me show you something else. So if we got 3 columns, that's fine. But now let me present you a problem. Imagine I'm back to Flex. Yeah. So back to what we did on the last week. What happened if I got a 4th column? Something like that. Yeah? Item 1, item 2, item 3, and item 4. Can anyone tell me how the layout will look like using Flex? Equal 1/4. Interesting. So based on that idea, Elena, so you think that we'll have 4 columns, yeah, with Flex? Yes, correct. What do you think, guys? Do you agree with Elena or not? All right. So you are all right. You are all right. Yeah. So you see, as Elena said, each column fills 1/4 of the available space. Fantastic. And what if I now change my layout from Flex to Grid? Will it be the same? Why not? That's correct, Elia and everyone else. You need to add another FR. What happened if I don't add another 1 FR on the right hand side? How will the layout look like? That's correct, Vicky. That's correct, Vicky. So based on that technique, based on that setup, we're gonna have 3 columns. So this is gonna look like a font pad when you got 3 columns, and then the 4th column will move to a new row. Look, you see? So if you're building a calculator or something like that, that may be useful. But that's important. That's important because with grid, look at the difference, guys. Look at the difference. With grid, you explicitly tell, hey, I want 1 column, I want 2 columns, I want 3 columns, I want 27 columns. You tell the browser. With Flex, however, it's some sort of dynamic. Yeah? With Flex, you don't tell, I want 1 column, I want 2 columns, I want 3 columns. You tell, hey, I want to allocate all the elements within the same row. I don't care if I got 1, 2, 3, or 47. Okay? All the elements will be allocated within the same row. Which one is better? Well, it depends, right? Sometimes you want to have a fluid layout. Sometimes you want to allocate all the available items within the same row. Sometimes, however, you don't want that. Sometimes you want to have 1 column, or 2 columns, or 3 columns, or 4 columns. And if there is new content, you want to display it at the bottom. Yeah. So I wouldn't say that one style is better than the other. It all depends on what you want to build. If you want a strict layout with a given number of fixed columns, grid will work much better. If you want some sort of dynamic layout where the number of columns will depend on the content, then Flex will work much better. And it's important to tell you something. That's some sort of default behavior. However, if you spend some minutes on Google, you'll find out that that default behavior can be changed. So with Flex, there's a way to tell Flex, hey, no, in reality, I want a specific number of columns somehow. So if I got more elements than columns, then move them to a new line. And on the other way around, with Grid, there is a way to make some sort of fluid layout. Like, I don't care, I don't want to specify 3 or 2 or 4 columns. I want to have as columns as elements I have. So long story short, even though by default somehow Flex is more dynamic than Grid and Grid is stricter than Flex, in reality, they can both work on the other way around. Yeah? So don't be very strict. Don't be very strict with these guidelines. But this is just some sort of approximation about what Grid is and what Flex is. So generally speaking, long story short, if you want a strict layout with a fixed number of columns, I would use Grid. If, however, you want a dynamic number of columns, I would use Flex instead. Any questions? No? So based on that, I have to tell you something, and that's maybe a bit personal. I've been using Flex and Grid for almost 3 years now. Probably Flex even more than that, Flex maybe 4 or 5 years. And the thing is, even though obviously at the beginning you take that rule of thumb, right? Depending on what you want to build, you use one or the other. I have to tell you something. Today, I use Grid more often than Flex. Let me tell you why. And again, this is just based on my experience. Yeah? I'm not going to tell you this is based on any standard. No. This is just based on my experience. Let me tell you the reasons why, even though I could be using Flex, I prefer to use Grid. I'm going to give you 2 reasons. The first one is quite theoretical and maybe you may not like it. The second one is bold. The second one is a big difference between these two and it's not obvious. So the first thing is, yes, Flex is dynamic. So if I got 3 columns, 4 columns, it works. But guys, eventually, if I got a lot of content like that, eventually it's not going to work. You see? So at some point, unless you clearly know that you'll have only 2 or 3 or 4 columns, at some point, you need to handle that. You need to handle the situation. So that flexibility that Flex gives you, at some point, stops being an advantage anymore. Because at some point, you need to tell Flex, hey, wait a minute. Yes, I want a fluid layout unless I got more than, 10 columns, in which case I want to introduce some sort of a special handling, in which case everything becomes more complicated. Yeah? So that theoretical advantage of Flex stop being an advantage anymore at some point. yeah, in the majority of the occasions. That's the first reason. But the second one is vital. It's absolutely vital. And to present you the big advantage of grid versus flex, let me show you a problem. So imagine that I got 3 columns. Yeah, I'm using flex, and I got a question for you. I got a question. The question is, I want to have some space. Yeah? I want to have some space, some gather between items, some space between item 1 and item 2, and some space between item 2 and item 3. Can anyone tell me, one person at a time, how can I do it? Max? No, listen, I'm using flex. Vicky? Where? On the item? Yeah, margin what? All right, but wait a minute. I don't want to have any vertical margin. I'm going to add the border on the container. And then I'll show you what happened. That's not what I want. I don't want any margin on the left of the first item. Yes, exactly. Just between 1 and 2. All right, you tell me. So how do I do that? Like that? I want a margin of 10 pixels, for instance. Yeah. If I do that, that's first of all not correct, because look what happened with that space, that margin on the right hand side. All right, so you want me to add item 1, item 2, and then what else? So you tell me, Vicky. And then, all right, and then that's not correct because I don't have any margin between 1 and 2. Something like that. All right, listen, that works. However, what happened, Vicky, if I add a 4th column? Will that work? So do I need to change my CSS every time I change my HTML? That's about joke, right, guys? I'm not gonna do that, right? So someone may be thinking, hey, no, but there are better ways to do that. Instead of adding up individual class to each item, that will be a problem sooner or later. You know, in CSS there is some sort of pseudo selector. Not sure if you've seen that, but there is something called item last child, I think it's called. When you do that, then you can say, all right, I want all my items to have margin right 10 pixels, and then the last one, margin right 0. You see, it works, but I'll tell you something. Yes, that's fine. So I'm not going to tell you this is impossible to solve using Flex. Yeah, of course it's possible. You see, we've solved it, but it took us 5 minutes to find a way. I'm not a big fan. I'm not a big fan of this solution because it feels a bit annoying. Hey, the only thing I want to do is I want to add some space between my boxes. Why the hell I need to do this weird stuff here? Yeah, because for instance, I don't know. I can think about so many problems, so many scalability problems of this pattern that I don't want to use it. However, let's try to solve the same problem using grid. So let me comment out all the flex stuff. I'm back to grid. So first of all, let me prove it works. So we got 4 columns, right? So we got 4 columns, and it works, right? So now, I think Max had an idea before about how to add the spacing between my columns using grid. Yeah. Yeah. Look, that's correct, Max. You see how simple it is to add some spacing between my elements. Boom. That's it. Yeah? So to me, working with grid is hassle-free at some point. Yeah. Because if I want to do something simple, it is simple. If I want to do something more complicated, of course, it will be more complicated. But simple things remain simple. And that's, to me, the beautifulness about using grid. Grid gap, and then you specify the gap. That's it between your columns. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah. Also, it's pretty interesting to see how it looks like using the DevTools, because, for instance, if I go on DevTools and I select my columns, you'll see that DevTools will, you see, not sure if you can spot that, but it's adding some dots. Can I zoom that? Let me try to zoom it. Maybe it works. I don't know. Not sure if you can see that, but DevTools is quite smart when identifying grid because it's adding some dots surrounding all my columns and everything, right? So it's pretty interesting tool indeed. Any questions? Yep. Hmm. No, so justify content is something completely unrelated. So justify content talks about the alignment of the elements. Talks about whether all the elements should be moved to the left, should be moved to the center, should be moved to the right, all these sort of things, right? But that has nothing to do with the space. You're right, you don't specify, I want 10 pixels, I want 20 pixels. So one thing is the alignment. You know, when you're writing a document with Microsoft Word or any other, writing tool, you write a piece of text and then you justify. Yeah, when you are writing your CV, you justify the text either to the left, to the right. You decide the formatting of your text. So that's pretty much the same thing when talking about flex and grid. You can justify your content, but that has nothing to do with the margin, with the exact amount of pixels separating your elements. Any questions, guys? Let me share some resources because grid, I've just showed you the basics, but grid is a huge world, trust me. So if you remember on the last week, we got a CSS Flex box. I show you that article. Let me share it again in case someone missed it. So let me share it again on Slack right now. All right, so this is the intro to Flex, which is a really good article. When talking about grid, there is a very similar blog post from CSS Tricks. So CSS Grid, CSS Grid. I think probably if I just search CSS Grid, I will get the CSS Trick. Here you go. So the first entry is about CSS Grid. Yeah. So I'll show that as well on Slack. Some keynotes about Flex versus Grid. So generally speaking, we use Flex when we want to have a single direction. Either all the elements written in one line, one row, or all the elements written in one column. Grid, in the long term, is way more powerful when dealing with multi-level grids, when having, for instance, multiple rows with multiple columns. When you're thinking about a complex structure, then grid works much better. If you want some examples, so if you go to the platform, what is that? So if I go to codegrid.com, you got on the intermediate level of HTML and CSS. Let me show you. You got 2 modules about Flex. Let me show you. you got two modules about Flex. I think I briefly saw that last week. But the thing is, you also get a module about Grid. So if I select Grid, just to give you an idea about what sort of things can you do with Grid. So this is pretty much what we've done today. Okay, creating a layout with 2 columns, blah, blah, blah. Different sizes. Actually, we can do that. Let's do that, guys. So imagine that we got 2 columns to simplify things a bit using Grid. Can anyone tell me how to make the second column twice as large as the first column? Yep. Yep. The second one should occupy 2/3 of the space. That's correct. You see? So now, how many fragments our column has? 3. That's correct. The first one will span 1/3, and the second one will span 2/3. So back to my web browser, you see, that's the way you can easily play with different column size using Grid. Yeah? So once again, for simple use case scenarios, Grid is fantastic. For more complex scenarios, Grid is very powerful, but it may be challenging. Let me show you one of my favorite questions. So question number 5, you see, that's pretty much impossible to build using Flex. So with Grid, you can create, and that's quite useful. For instance, if you are building, imagine that your portfolio or some sort of complex web application where you got some areas. So with Grid, you can easily play with the positioning of these areas. I'm not going to explain how to do that. But if just FYI, that Grid was built thinking on the idea of building super complex layouts. Yeah, so you got that training exercise, that training pack on the platform if you want to practice a bit. And one last thing from my side. So if you want to practice a bit more with Flex and Grid, maybe you know that there are some online games to practice with Flex and Grid. I think the Flex one is called CSS Flex, Box Frog. Yeah, Frog, not Frog, Frog. I can do it. I need another coffee, guys. It was a long weekend. Frog. So Flexbox Froggy, right? So that's quite entertaining. That's a way to learn Flex by playing a game of moving the frog somewhere around the screen, trying not to be eaten by my dog. Yeah, so these sort of things. And when talking about Grid, there is a similar one called Grid Garden or something like that. Grid Garden, yeah, cssgridgarden.com, easy peasy, where it's pretty much the same thing. But in this particular case, you need to build some sort of user interface using Grid. So these games are quite interesting. And obviously, I completely recommend you to get some habit of playing with Flex and Grid. Cool. Anything else, guys? One last word from my side. So remember, after the lockdown, after the bootcamp, blah, 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 many of you will apply to job positions. And the thing is, at some point, the employer will assume you got some basic understanding about JavaScript, about React. So that will be expected. Yeah, all the candidates will have some basic understanding about JavaScript and React. Fine. However, don't forget that you'll be fighting to break into tech with other developers with the same commercial experience as you, with a similar background, blah, blah, blah. So what's my message? You are expected to do something different. Because if you do the same as everyone else, where is the difference? What is your value on the market? So I'm not going to tell you, please master Grid or please master Flexbox, but that's a good candidate. So if you go to a job interview and you proved like, hey, yes, I'm a junior developer in HTML, JavaScript, React, whatever. However, because of personal interest, I've been doing a lot of research about Flex and Grid. Look, I created this project on GitHub. You can play it. If you do a lot of research about these things, that gives you some sort of advantage in that hiring process, because you are offering something different. Companies may not expect you to be really good with Flex and Grid, but if you are good on these things, you get advantage. Don't forget something, guys. Many tech companies, they have really good JavaScript developers and so on, but many companies struggle to build CSS. So they are desperate to hire developers with some sort of appetite to improve the visual part of the application. So once again, I'm not telling you please master CSS Grid and Flexbox to get a job. I'm not telling you that, but definitely you need to master something. You need to focus. You need to be an expert on something. It could be visuals, it could be testing, as we'll talk later on during the bootcamp. I don't know. Whatever. You need to be motivated, guys, to spend a good amount of hours practicing with that topic. But this is a good example because I think this is quite visual, and many developers like the visual part of the development journey. So just keep an eye on these things. And of course, if you got any questions, just let me know. Anything else, guys? Yeah, of course. I can do cssguardian.com, and then if I search on Google is your friends, guys. So if you search CSS Flexbox Frog, so I'm sure it's the first result, right? So flexboxfroggy.com. So I'll share it with you on Slack. By the way, no problem at all, my friend. So you've seen that both websites are created by the same guy, which is great, right? Because they share the same UI, the same styling, the same learning methodology. So that should simplify things a bit, hopefully. Anything else, guys? No? Cool, fantastic. So that was it from my side. Thank you very much, and